Hello and welcome to week 4 of Anthropology 390, Mediterranean Archaeology. This week is going to be a busy week like all weeks. It's going to be all about prehistory and history, which is a really lot to talk about in one week. The entire prehistory and history of one region. We have a series of readings. I'll talk about those in a moment this week. And we have your weekly reading questions, a video on obsidian use, as well as a discussion about that video. I've placed the readings in a specific order because I think that that's how they can best be understood. The Mediterranean island voyages focuses on sea activity, early sea activity, when the islands were first occupied. Assimilation in the maritime regions is an excerpt from a book by Barry Cunliffe. Excerpts from chapter 12 of The Human Past. What those are a couple of pages focusing on activities, particularly in the western central Mediterranean during the Neolithic and Copper Ages. And then finally, from the same book, The Human Past, is the largest reading that you'll have this week, which is an entire chapter of that book entitled The Mediterranean World. This is from an introductory to archaeology textbook, but it's also rather a good basic read because they summarize an awful lot of information in really a very few pages. You might look and panic for a moment and say, but that's not very few. That's like 45 pages. Yeah, 45 pages of dense reading. Do you need to memorize it all? No. Do you need to read it? Absolutely. Absolutely, because everything we're going to do in the future really is going to depend on you having refreshed your memory of this entire history. A lot of the sites discussed, not really discussed at length, but referenced in this big reading will be discussed in much more depth in your other reading. So really sort of important to get that basic foundation to build on from here. And then finally, I've just scanned a few helpful timelines from that same book, The Human Past. Okay, you ready? Here I go. I'm finding this like an overwhelming potential task to try and get through the entire prehistory and history, but I'm going to, without babbling on at length for ridiculous periods of time, because, I mean, let's face it, this is the content easily of an entire course, actually multiple courses. So wish me luck and bear with me. Here we go. So looking at the prehistory of Paleolithic and Neolithic, what I want to first bring up to you is the fact that when peoples were first coming out of Africa and spreading into Western Asia and then continuing to spread east and west and north from there, the sea levels were at a different height. So remember that a lot of the world's water was encapsulated in glaciers. But as the world warmed up, the glaciers melted and sea levels rose. So when people are first coming out of Africa, i.e. sort of potentially, we think, inhabiting places like Mediterranean islands like Crete, maybe even 170,000 years ago, the world's the Mediterranean Sea was at a much lower level. So much so, I mean, one of my favorite points of reference here is that imagine that at that period of time, Ireland is connected to Scotland and England, and which is in turn actually connected to continental Europe. So it could have made a substantial difference. Granted, there was still plenty of water, enough water to need some kind of flotation device, hopefully a flotation device that they could ensure, some sort of direction. A sail? I don't know. We have no idea. So evidence of human occupation indeed by 170,000 years ago in Crete. That evidence is in the way of human-made tools. Cyprus, we see occupation. I'm skipping Ionian Islands. That's our next oldest date, approximately 110,000 years ago, which is north of Crete. In fact, the first islands that appear to be occupied by humans are all in the eastern Mediterranean. Cyprus substantially far behind the other two, but that's basically what evidence we've found so far. Our record is constantly changing, and we are constantly updating these things to older and older and older dates. But the oldest one we have right now for Cyprus is 11,700, and from there we see both on land and on sea a spread generally to the west in the Mediterranean. In the Paleolithic period, some of our best evidence for human occupation comes in the amazing cave paintings. One of my favorite examples, one of the very earliest in France, all the way in the west there, is Chauvet Cave. And that cave dates in the 30,000s BC. Most of the islands in the Mediterranean have evidence of some sort of Neolithic activity. There are a couple of exceptions here. Pantelleria is just one of those exceptions. According to Cunliffe, who focuses on this particular region in your readings of assimilation and maritime regions, the Neolithic culture or package spread throughout the whole southern zone by 5400 BC. And evidence for this is in the way of what they refer to as the Neolithic package. So what does this package include? Well, it includes pottery, a certain type of pottery that they find everywhere. Sometimes there's a slight regional twist to it, but basically it looks like the examples on this page here. You see on the far right a sort of cup, and then towards the bottom there, various sherds of pottery, all with similar impressions on it. That's what we call when we sort of push something into it. And these impressions are made with a particular kind of shell called a cardium shell, which is where we get that reference of cardial wear. We also see tools of polished stone. A good example of that is at the top of the page, where we see a recreation of a Neolithic axe handle with the actual polished axe head on it. Throughout these sites, we see cultivation of wheat and barley. These are not indigenous plants of the region, and the varieties of wheat and barley that they're cultivating are all the same, and they're all coming from the east. We also see domesticated sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. Again, these are animals that are not indigenous of these areas, and they're being imported throughout all the new Neolithic settlements. And it's for this reason that people like Cunliffe give the means by which this cultural tool package is being spread. They call it enclave colonization, where they presume that groups of people, perhaps each generation, are expanding westward or to new places. What the mindset is behind that cultural phenomena is beyond me and Cunliffe as well. So note that not all archaeologists actually agree with Cunliffe. He points that out himself in the very first page of the reading that you have by him. And also there's an inclination towards this in a couple of references that are made in your big reading for this week of the Mediterranean world. I'm referring especially to a reference on page 473, where Cherry and Alcock talk about the great diversity in the Mediterranean world during the Neolithic. Sure, there's diversity, but there's also what Cunliffe sees as common assimilated cultural traits. So it's we're still working on trying to figure out what's going on and why we have these trends. So with respect especially, I've already mentioned this a little, to the Mediterranean world reading, so that's that chapter in the human past. I wanted to reiterate that our approach this semester will be mostly thematic, For example, we definitely will be looking at the countryside in general, but various aspects of that. Identity is going to be an entire week's focus. I may do a week on trade. I'm tempted, but I'm also, I confess, I think I'm leaning more towards the colonization towards at the very end. We're definitely doing a week about housing and domestic life. So all these, we're not going to go through this course generally in a chronological way. We're going through it in a somatic way. The only exception will be next week, in which we're focusing on the Bronze Age in particular, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean. So as we go through all these thematic studies about ancient Mediterranean archaeology, the authors of your readings, specifically if you look at your textbook of classical archaeology, they're going to presume that you are operating with a basic knowledge of the history throughout the region, throughout certainly the Greek and Roman periods of the region. And so they're going to constantly be making reference to these things. So it's really, really important for you to not be completely lost and to refresh any memory that you have from secondary school or primary school or potentially other classes in your college careers in which you were first introduced to the histories of these regions. It's also meant to help fill in some of those blanks, because I don't think any of you have come to the table as historical experts. And quite honestly, your textbooks don't expect you to be experts in the region. So we all have holes. Certainly all of you have a lot more holes than I do, because I do have a PhD in this topic. So it's meant to help with filling in some of those blanks. So here I go. What I'm going to try and do in the rest of this presentation is to focus on summarizing that big reading, the Mediterranean world, giving you this super brief overview of all of the rest of history. Mostly I'm going to give you lots of pictures, and I'm going to try not to talk too much, but hopefully help smooth over some rough edges from your reading. Your reading spends a fair amount of time talking about the Bronze Age, and that is, again, something that we're going to spend a lot more time on next week. So Alcock and Cherry, in brief, tell you just a little bit about what's happening in the West Central Mediterranean. They definitely refer to the scale of sites and human groups, i.e. populations, as being relatively small in village-like settings, much like they were during the Neolithic period. There are a couple exceptions to that. And they talk about the Eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean peoples and the first island civilization on Crete. And so I'll give you an overview of all these things here. And we'll talk about all the pictures you see on this particular page as we get to these this quick survey of these cultures. On the left here is going to be the cultures in Sardinia. Then we're going to move, we see here with this bronze hut urn, we're going to go to Italy. Then Spain, and then we'll go east to the Cyclades and to the island of Crete. So here we are. Nuraghi. Now, this is not the first time you've been introduced to the word Nuraghi. In fact, last week's readings by Peter van Domelen, the ones that were more theoretically based, used as a case study the island of Sardinia and these Nuraghi. So now you can see what one looks like. So I've given you 3 Nuraghi here. We think they're sort of stone-walled villages. Obviously, the big sort of tower structures and the walls are meant for protective purposes. Top right, we see the Nuraghi Paras. Bottom left, we see the Nuraghi Sunoraxi. And in the bottom middle, you have the Nuraghi Surachi. So you can see definitely common points of similarity between all of these different Nuraghi, and you can see that clearly they're being made within a common culture. Bronze Age in the Italian Peninsula. Wow. So much to talk about. We have a variety of Italic peoples living throughout the Italian peninsula. One of our best known cultures is we call Villanovan culture, called Villanovan based on the first site of Villanova that it was actually discovered. And whenever we see that particular cultural package at all other places, we call it now Villanovan. So mostly, as you can see in the map here in the top right, that the region is focusing on northwest portion of the Italian peninsula. We know at this time these people are practicing cremation. And what's interesting is that it's particularly important because that's going to change when they start to interact with foreign peoples towards the end of the Bronze Age and in the Iron Age. I've given you a display here of material culture from these people. In fact, I might be able to go back and talk about them just a bit more. Unfortunately, not in depth. When we get to talk about Iron Age peoples, we're going to do a segment on Iron Age peoples in which we look at people like Phoenicians and Etruscans. So these Villanovans are basically the Bronze Age versions of people that are going to be called Etruscans as well as Romans. So bottom left here is a fibula. In the plural, it's fibulae, and they're basically sort of it's a pin. It's a bronze pin that's meant to hold your clothes on. Without it, they would fall off, and it would be uncomfortable or cold at least. And then we have next going right a bronze vessel. These Bronze Age Villanovan people are Bronze Age. They're excellent at making bronze. Yeah, well, it's true. In fact, their successors, the Etruscans, are going to be absolutely talented at it as well. In the center is a lovely rare piece. It's the one I showed you in the previous slide as well. This is a model representation of a hut, and this is really helpful with respect to understanding the kind of houses they lived in. It's really interesting when we compare it to archaeological evidence, and where we can see post holes that align with post holes in this picture. Do you see? My mouse is working, right? Are you impressed? Right? I haven't mentioned that. Do you see post? Yeah, there'd be post holes that match these. It's also interesting we look later on at Etruscan buildings that are going to come much later, how those are going to be adorned in the same way with acroteri is what we call them. Sorry to bust out weird words on you. So anyway, this is an urn though, which is really interesting. And we're going to find later that they're also going to be made out of clay. And so the ashes of the dead would be put inside this. This is these two on the right here are another form of burial vessel. They're another form of urn. We call them biconical urns, right, for really basic reasons, because we kind of have like one upside down cone on top of another cone. So biconical urns, those are made with a impasto, a sort of rough clay, and they're topped usually. You can see the one on the left is topped with sort of a bowl, a vessel, and the one on the right is topped with what was an Etruscan helmet. Not Etruscan, I hear Villanovan helmet. And to be perfectly honest, we're going to see in the Etruscan period that we find helmets that are very similar to this, which makes perfect sense. I mean, to have a certain, cultural progression in the region, rather than a complete, abrupt change from an earlier culture. That's all I'm allowed to say on this. Bronze Age Iberia. Here we are in the Iberian Peninsula, roughly modern Spain and Portugal. Your readings reference to a couple of sites, Los Milares in Amarilla. At this site, we see inhumation, burials in Tholos tombs. Tholos tombs I have a question on your reading question about Tholos tombs and asking you to compare references to Tholos tombs here to those that they're talking about in Crete. So basically, Tholos tomb is a, well, much like you see in this top right hand photo here. So kind of cone or dome structures in which one often finds multiple burials. Grave goods are really interesting here in Iberia because we think of the Bronze Age. In fact, I have to say, in general, we tend to underestimate the people of the past. We look at them through eyes of we are somehow smarter and better at them. I think most anthropologists are pretty good at realizing how ridiculous that is. Certainly, we can go back to the Paleolithic period in that slide where I showed you that amazing picture at Chauvet Cave, and you can then, eject any remaining visions in your head of Stone Age peoples being rude in cave, sort of like thumping each other on the top of heads with clubs and that sort of thing. And then the Bronze Age as well. We underestimate these people. We think that they're, oh, wow, they're just, they've hardly been farming for very long, so, I mean, geez, how clever can they be? But the truth is they've been interacting in a very, very, very sophisticated way for a very, very long time. So we shouldn't be too excited, getting back to the topic here, when we look at the Tholos tombs at Los Milares, that we find a number of interesting grave goods that include imports from rather far away, places that required sea travel in order to connect with these places. We see the same thing at the other site mentioned here, Valencina de la Concepcion. Here we also have grave goods of exotic materials coming from faraway places, like such as Africa and islands. So, in fact, this is also one of the exceptions. Before I said that in the Bronze Age, in the West Central Mediterranean, your authors Alcock and Cherry had said that mostly the sites are all small like they were in the Neolithic. And I had mentioned there were some exceptions. And indeed, this is one of those exceptions, because here we don't have just a small village. We have a 1,000-acre site. And this one also includes chamber tombs. Looking at some of the material culture I've given you and other photos, I just want to show you at the top here, this is a picture of Los Milares. And this is a recreation of what it looked like. And so this is also, pretty expansive. Top right corner is an example, one of the chamber tombs from this particular site. You can see right outside the walls here, one of those tombs. And also these are grave goods from the site. It's interesting that we see this particular type of iconography on a lot of the vessels there. And at the bottom, I've mainly shown you pictures of Valencina de la Concepcion. We have this entity in the bottom left corner with the eyes and so forth is actually in this, see, with the 3 stripes on his face, is actually very like this one over on the right here with the eyes and the 3 stripes in his face. And what's interesting too is we see these kinds of things in a lot of the island settlements. Certainly we have them in Sicily in prehistory as well. What they mean, I just don't know. Also wanted to point out one of the really extraordinary finds from this particular site is this beautiful dagger made with an ivory handle, and this is completely opaque rock crystal. So it must have been incredibly important and wealthy thing. I can't help but notice, I don't know about you, but I keep looking at that handle and thinking it looks like a set of teeth. What do you guys think? I'm not sure. I've not actually read in depth on that dagger itself, so I'd be interested to see what others think. Anyway, I'm digressing, and now I'm going forward. So continuing the Bronze Age now and switching to the eastern part of the Mediterranean, looking at the Cycladic Islands. So here we are in the east. You've had references to these kinds of things both in your reading by Jack Davis from the previous week, and you've also saw a reference to it in your readings for this week in the Mediterranean world when they talked about these. So I thought, I'll let you have a look at more examples of it. In fact, this one right here on the top left is the very one that was pictured in your readings. In fact, throughout this presentation, whenever possible, I've tried to include some of the pictures that they showed you in the reading so that you could see them in color. And so that these topics were hopefully, again, connecting for you with your readings. So I threw in a bunch of other examples of these kinds of figurines. How your readings have talked about how they've been illegally looted for a very long period of time. And it's interesting to along those lines to point out that this particular one here, it's not a great image, I'm sorry, but that's the best that Christie's would allow me, because that's where I got that. Yeah, I put a link on your the Canvas page to show you that Christie's is selling this particular figure for $250,000. So I guess that's why people are looting. That's right. That's something I talk about in my intro to archaeology class, is that if people didn't buy stolen goods, then there would be a lot less incentive to steal them. That's all I'm saying. So here's a perfect example. So that's why we really have a lack of provenance for a lot of these things, and they're still a mystery to us because so many of them have been dug up and looted. But they are beautiful. Normally they're just a single person, but sometimes they're multiple people. The most common ones are upright, just like the one for sale at Christie's. Although sometimes we get seated ones. This guy's seated and is playing a musical instrument, which is kind of cool because we know that in the Bronze Age, we have music is an important part of life. Often they are presented like this center one with the arms folded, and the Christie's ones with the arm folded, and this trio at the bottom with the center one and its arms folded. And for that reason, they're often called folded arm figures, or FAFs. Anyway, we could talk about those some more, but again, we're out of time. Another artifact from this region, from the Cycladic Islands that your authors mentioned, are these things that they called frying pans. That's the only name you get that they gave for these. Other scholars have labeled them mirrors instead. I think it's a problem in general when we give things names like that and we don't actually know what their functions are. Sometimes it actually inhibits our quest to understand them. There's no evidence that these things are frying pans. There's no evidence that they connect with heat in that way. They may be mirrors, but to tell you the truth, as far as I know, no one's come up with a particularly compelling explanation as to what they were used for yet. Your readings also mentioned other sites in the Aegean region, in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. In particular, the readings discussed peoples on the island of Crete by the name of Minoans. We're going to be spending a lot more time on these people next week. So the pictures I have here are just really, just not hardly even a taste of what you're going to see next week. Looking at the pictures, just to tell you what they are, I've chosen a random group of things. This particular one in the corner, I believe, is more or less the same shot that is offered to you in your textbook. You can see the dolphins on the wall in the fresco, and these circular sort of floral designs on the panels in between the doorways. This particular area was dubbed by the original excavator to be the Queen's Megaron, or the Queen's apartments. Down here is another part of the same site. This site at the top is the site of Knossos. In fact, looking down here at the bottom, here's the grand plan of Knossos. And so this Queen's Megaron is just one of the many rooms you can find in this plan. Further, this was a multi-storied structure. It's not a building per se. It's something much more akin to a sprawling community center, villagey type place that had multiple things going on there at the same time, from craftsmanship to religious functions, to the residential quarters of what we think is were at least elite members of the society. So again, this Queen's Megaron is one of the fancier, more elaborate residential areas. So the bottom picture in the right bottom corner is also a part of Knossos that is on display today. Some of the paint that you see here are reconstructions based on fragments that were visible upon excavation. And the two other pictures that I've got included here, just because I had to make choices. One is on the far left bottom corner is a vessel which we call a rhyton. This would have needed sort of a tripod or sort of a framework in which to sit in to be able to sit upright. Otherwise, you see it would have fallen over. But I include it mostly because it was included in your text. If you look carefully, you can see that you have these goats sitting on top of what appears to be a structure. And perhaps I'll get to talk more about that next week. And finally, at the top here, we see one of the many vessel forms used for burials on Minoan Crete. I'm particularly interested in these because that was my master's thesis. I looked at various kinds of burial evidence, burial vessels, and I can tell you that by and large, this particular kind of burial vessel, which we call a larnax, or larnaces in plural, is probably the least used form, but the most fascinating form from our perspective. Sometimes plain, but usually highly decorated with all kinds of symbolism that we've come to, because of the repetitive nature of some of these symbols in various contexts, we've come to understand them as religious symbols. In here we see this double axe. We have gold versions of the double axe. We have double axes painted everywhere. It seems to be a ritualistic item of some sort. We also see lots of evidence of what Evans called, and I think they're referred to in your text as well, in quotes, horns of consecration, because it's just such a weird thing that he did. Anyway, Evans was the first excavator of Knossos, so maybe I'll go on a bit more about him next week again. So these what appear like bull horns, he calls them horns of consecration, whatever that means. Basically, they are horns that probably do replicate bull horns, and we have lots more bull imagery in Crete, but and they are like the double axe associated with religion and ritual. Also on the island of Crete, but much later, as your book points out, and potentially a player in the demise of the Minoan people, we're not sure about that at all, whose language succeeds the language of Minoans on Crete. Now, Minoans had linear A, a form of writing, and the Mycenaeans, the people who I'm talking about here, practiced the same writing style, but to write a different language. And the language their Mycenaeans are writing in is a very early form of Greek, whereas the Minoan language was clearly not any form of Greek. So this is a few random, again, images from this particular culture, who is largely based in the Greek mainland and the Peloponnese, but also in the late Bronze Age. They're the major presence on the island of Crete. The top right picture, I think, is a picture, maybe not the identical one, but one very like one offered in your textbook, which shows a monumental gateway into the city of Mycenae. A reconstructed plan of the city is actually located below here. This is more or less what we've got left of the city. And so this is probably the gateway you're seeing here is probably this gateway. In fact, you can see a little bit of that, the sculpture right there. Originally, these would have been lions. They're just missing their heads. So that flanked, this central column. So this picture here also reflects a reconstruction, an artist reconstruction on what would have been what we think was the primary architectural feature in this particular citadel, which would have been right here. And that particular architectural structure is called a megaron, which had a very particular form. Your authors refer to it briefly, but again, you'll be learning more about the megaron when we study households and household architecture in a later week. Also found at this site, I don't know if I mentioned the name of the site yet, to be perfectly honest. It's actually the type site of this cultural group. This is the site of Mycenae. It is not the only site that the Mycenaeans inhabited, and I've already said that they were in the Peloponnese and mainland Greece and Crete. But it is the name site for this cultural group, Mycenaeans. So this is from Megaron. This is the reconstruction with the central hearthway, with 4 columns and an open space for the smoke and so forth. We think these places would have been highly decorated in polychrome. Also found at this site in one of the grave circles. Here's one of the grave circles depicted actually on the site map here. Was this particular golden mask. Now, this was excavated initially by a guy named Heinrich Schliemann, who is not an archaeologist, but somebody who was determined, a guy with a lot of money, determined to go out and prove that Homer's Iliad really happened. Some of you may have read it in high school. Some of you have only just heard of it. The authors of your textbook suggest that at some point it may actually have happened. Honestly, the jury's still out. My most recent conversation with one of the excavators was that there is no proof that any sort of destruction level corresponds whatsoever to any time period that would have where this great heroic battle would have happened. So as far as I'm concerned, the jury's still out. There's still a lot of people with passionate opinions one way or another. And it's a debate that's been long going. But the Mycenaeans, one thing we know for sure, were not a peaceful people. Peaceful people don't build gigantic, thick walls. Those are people who are expecting trouble. And often people who are expecting trouble are people out there causing trouble. If you look at the image that I have included at the bottom here, this is from a Mycenaean pot, which shows Mycenaeans going into battle wearing boar's tooth helmets and carrying shields behind them and spears and so forth. So that's about all I'm going to allow myself to say about Mycenaeans right now. Like I said, more next week. Okay, progressing on. I am going to try and keep it down to a minimum here, but I'm not doing spectacularly so far, I confess. So I've got more words on this one. Yeah, because I just think it's complex, to be perfectly honest. Because what follows the Bronze Age is a period called the Dark Age, and a lot of these dates that I'm going to be giving you, I give you for the Bronze Age, and I'll be giving you for subsequent ages after this, are are general, and quite honestly, that's about all I'm hoping to get from you. Is this general understanding that it more or less encompasses these centuries, and what happens before and after, which period. So, why is this the Dark Age? Well, it's because it's dark to us. Quite honestly, because there's not a lot of evidence. When we get a lot of archaeological evidence, it comes usually because of some kind of economic and cultural fluorescence, i.e., there's a lot of stuff. A community is doing really well. It preserves things in burial or garbage deposits, or by way of large, opulent settlements. We don't have that kind of thing, and we don't really have a lot of writing or anything else going on in this period. In fact, so we're not really sure. So last time we looked in Greece, and that's when we're talking about, Dark Age, we're more or less talking about Greece and those islands and so forth around the Aegean Sea. So the last time we got a lot of information was in the Mycenaean period. Then all of a sudden it just stops, and we don't see very much at all. So we think that there's some big things happening both in the Aegean and, quite honestly, in the Near East, Turkey and Mesopotamia and the Levant as well. Something has happened, and we're not exactly sure. And it may be a number of things. It could be partially climate oriented. Some people say that there are marauding peoples called sea peoples that are going around destroying things. Other scholars shake their heads at that now and say, oh gosh, not really. They couldn't have caused that much damage. But the truth is nobody really knows. But we see lots of areas that seem to be, well, completely depleted of their populations. Sites that are absolutely and totally abandoned during this period. Fewer settlements, smaller settlements. Nobody seems to be rich. There's a couple of exceptions. One of those exceptions is one that I'm showing you here, and it's one that's referenced in your textbook. I've got an arrow pointing at the map at the top. It's on the island of Euboea, and the site is Lefkande. And so what do we find at Lefkande that seems to contrast to other sites? Well, we get a huge structure for starters, this one that's recreated in the picture in the top right-hand corner. And we call this particular type of structure a haroan. So it's a really big structure. And we think it was most likely a residential structure, some kind of central architectural feature, perhaps utilized by some elite, a political, social elite. And it appears to have been ritually destroyed, burned down in a purposeful incident. Now, at that time of the destruction, or actually probably right before the destruction, it appears that there was a burial inside what was previously some kind of residential slash social political residential structure, and perhaps social political center of some sort. And the burials are curious as well. Now, there's a lot of reasons it's curious that the burials are curious. We see there are two burials here. See these two things right here, these two kind of squarish holy things, right? Now, my arrow is pointing to just one of them, because this one here that's larger with these, you can sort of see the outline of a skeleton, and then you see this circle here. That's just one of those burials. And in that particular burial is a male who seems to have been cremated, and a female who was interred, right? I.e. not cremated, but put into the earth. In the other burial are 4 horses. This is completely unique. We have never seen anything like this in the Bronze Age, but all of a sudden we see this extraordinary sort of set of circumstances, burial circumstances. Further, these graves are filled with precious items. Precious items. I mean, I've only shown you here this one, these one, the gold bra, so to speak. Yes, these are sort of gold cups that cover the breasts of the female. But she had all kinds of jewelry and a sort of a pectoral. They're objects of faience, which is a glass-like material that's being made sort of by Phoenicians and Egyptians. There are items coming from the Near East. So it seems that these people are very much in contact with the outside world and flourishing as a result. We don't know the story here, but it definitely, it's very different, like I said, than the other sites that have either been abandoned or severely diminished and seem impoverished. And those other small sites do not seem to be connected to an international world. In fact, they don't seem to be connected with, beyond their own borders. But this is something about this connection here has brought prosperity to this one site. And here we see social differentiation and access to world goods. Moving on to the next period, you see how I'm to the 9th and 8th century. Here again, these dates are a little bit wishy-washy, but I'm going to have to be satisfied with them because I think I'm giving you quite enough information in this course. So this Greek Orientalizing period, the reason it's called that, Orientalizing means sort of Easternizing. What they really mean is influences coming from further east. Here we're talking mostly about Greek lands that especially were held by Mycenaeans and which are going to be largely held by future Greeks. Those are those impoverished places, except Lefkandi, remember, that are now becoming less impoverished and are now starting to connect more and more with places in the East. Just like Lefkandi was doing, sort of a century or two before them, these people are starting to renew those connections. And they're being heavily, heavily influenced by those connections, ideas, and as well as material goods. I've shown here a couple of examples to prove my point. In the far left, I'm going to point to this image of this bird-like woman, and then also a similar bird-like creature on a pot below. The top one dates to the 8th century and is from a site in Anatolia called Urartu. The one below is from Greece 2 centuries later, showing the same sort of mythological creature. This suggests a few things. Number one, that the image of this mythological creature was prominent enough in Greek society 2 centuries later that people would have understood what it meant. So the myths have come with it. The stories and the meaning behind this creature was also transferred. And it was meaningful enough to the population at large in order for people to understand when it was depicted on the side of a pot. The next 2 images I want to show are also images of mythological creatures that are found both in the East and in the West. It's a creature called a griffin. And so I'm showing you on the top here a Mesopotamian version and then a Greek version at the bottom. And finally, my big pot on the far right shows a procession of both real creatures mixed with mythological creatures, all whose origin predate this in the Near East and in Mesopotamia. Even further. So throughout the century, a lot of the things that we see on vessels in the Aegean are showing a very profound influence from regions further east. The next period is my particular period of specialty, which we call the Greek Archaic period. Well, Greek, because we're kind of, well, basically, I think in a lot of ways we look at the world through the Greek evidence in many places. Um, Partly because in some places that's the evidence that gives us the most information. My own work, as you know, from my 2 hour long presentation in the first week, is during this period and focuses on the island of Sicily and attempts to look at the material remains not through a Greek lens, but instead through an indigenous lens. So at this point, the Greek world in general, the Aegean world, and as well as the world in the East, in Mesopotamia and the Levant and Anatolia, have all sort of recovered from whatever it is that hit in the 12th century. And we see, booming, prosperous groups of people that are flourishing and building and trading and active and connecting and creating. It's an extremely dynamic period, which is one of the reasons why it fascinates me so. But it's also a period when we see this diaspora, this sort of Greek activity manifesting itself not just in trade but in colonization. They don't just interact with peoples far away; they actually move there. So we see Greek colonies. The Greeks expanding from Greece, mainland Greece, and the Peloponnese. They expand south and create a colony actually in the area of Egypt called Naucratis. They expand to the west, creating colonies all along the very bottom part of the Italian peninsula. They expand further west, creating colonies on the island of Sicily. And they go as far west as modern Marseille in the Gulf of Lyon in southern France. So pretty exciting. So my own work is, based on trying to understand how indigenous people or peoples that were already inhabiting these areas, how they felt about all these Greeks coming in and setting up colonies in their neighborhoods. Looking at my pictures here really quick, I just want to point out that the one on the bottom left is from one of the Greek colonies in the Italian peninsula. To be perfectly honest, our very best examples of extant Greek temples in the entire Mediterranean are mostly found in the colonies, partly because there was a lot of temple building in this period. But so we have great temple remains in places like Sicily and southern Italy. In the middle is the particular style of vase painting that was very popular and prolifically traded throughout the Mediterranean, called black figure. This particular vessel is by one of the painters that was identified by Beazley. Remember Beazley from your very first week's readings? Exekius. So we've identified several pots by Exekius, largely due to the efforts of Beazley. Further to the right, you see a series of statues. Let's go to the far right first, looking at the male statue. In Greek they call them. This is a kouros. Kouros it's a male heroic figure. The Greeks felt the heroic individuals were depicted as nudes, and they found the male body particularly beautiful. On the other hand, at this particular period, it was not appropriate to show a female body without clothes on. It's definitely not an equal society. Another thing worth pointing out, and that's why I put this particular version of the female statue, which we call a kore, by the way, slightly different name. I show you this one because it shows a reconstruction of how this particular statue was painted. And now this is an important thing I hope you picked up from your readings, in that the Greek world was not a world of white marble. In fact, if you look back at the temple on the left side here, initially that temple would have been erected in multiple colors. The Greek world was a brightly colored world. It is only now, when all the paint has come off all the buildings and all the sculptures, that it now looks like a world of white marble. And it's funny that that world of white marble, in many ways, has been revered by many people over the centuries, and who have in turn revered the Greeks for their choice of this beautiful white pristine marble, when that's not what they did at all. Unfortunately. Moving on to the 5th century, which we generally call the Greek classical period. This is a dynamic period. This is probably the height of Greek prosperity and confidence. Certainly has had a remarkable influence over subsequent generations. Key events were the Persian Wars. Many people have heard of the Battle of Marathon, which happens at the very beginning of this particular century, and the Battle of Salamis. And both battles were battles where the Greeks defeated the far superior power of the Persians, and that gave them a huge amount of confidence. In particular, the Battle of Salamis. And I'm not going to go in and talk on and on about Salamis, but let us just say the Athenian fleet, which was largely built, the Athenian, I'm going to try to pare it down. Athenian fleet was successful. So the Athenians said, hey, we should, make sure the Persians never come back. And if they do, that we'll be ready. So we should make sure to build more ships. And moreover, we should give us the most credit for winning that war, and put us in charge of collecting funds from everybody to pay for this amazing fleet of ships. And Sparta didn't agree. In fact, a lot of people didn't agree. And eventually people start taking sides, because even though it'd gone well for a little while with, Athens sort of getting a club of allies called the Delian League, in which they all sort of supported the let's build ships. Eventually, some of that club started to fall out, because what Athens did is, all the money they collected, sure, they built some ships, but they also spent a lot of the money on themselves. Now, some of it was justified, because quite honestly, the Persians had demolished the city of Athens. So they felt, because they had incurred so much damage from the wars, that the rest of the Greeks really, in a way, owed them the ability to rebuild their city. Anyway, so lots of animosities are growing. Eventually it gets to, us and them, and more or less, I wouldn't call it civil war. Calling it civil war means there's a united Greece, and there is not a united Greece at this point. We have independent city-states, but a war of Greeks, one group of Greeks against another group of Greeks, the Peloponnesian War, which is a long drawn-out war. Eventually the Spartans win, but quite honestly, it just depletes the spirit and the bank accounts of and the male population of so many Greek cities. So they're in an incredibly weakened state by the end of it. So anyway, looking at my pictures here, again, I wanted to show you an example of a recreation of a painted sculpture with the Trojan archer on the bottom left, which is one of the many figures that are coming from this pediment. Pediment is the sort of the sculptures that are in the triangular space. Here, looking over here at the Parthenon, right? Because that's what's over in the right there. That triangular space is called a pediment. And the sculptures in there are pedamental sculptures, which these are pedamental sculptures of the Temple of Apphia on the island of Aegina. So these, like everything else, like the temples, would have been painted elaborately. And so they found enough remnants of paint on this particular archer to recreate the design, and it's extraordinary. So imagine if all of these were painted. Speaking of sculpture, it's considered probably one of the more influential times of with respect to art and sculpture and the idealized representation of the human body. One of the important pieces of this period, mid-5th century, is the Discobolos, right here, depicted here. So it's also how should I say, the main type of vase painting that's done in this particular period differs from the archaic, because remember in the archaic period we had black figure. Well, now there's a new trend. This new trend says red figure. So previously we'd had black forms on a red background. Now we have red forms on a black background. So, and yes, I've already referred to the Parthenon here, not only as a temple, i.e. something that would have been colorful, and as a temple that had a pediment, much like this pediment right on the Temple of Apphia, but it is also one of the key structures that is being rebuilt with all that money that Athens is collecting from the Delian League, right? So it's part of what of the issues of recovering from the Persian Wars, but also bring the activities that are bringing bad feelings that will eventually lead to the Peloponnesian War. Whew, that's a lot of history in a short period of time. You with me? You need a break? Get a cup of tea or something? I'm going to keep going on. You can pause me if you want. Getting there. We're in the Hellenistic period. We still have the Romans to do. Oh my gosh. This is going to be another long one. Sorry, guys. So, Hellenistic period, in short, right? Greeks are like, remember I said after the Peloponnesian War, depleted of spirit and funds, etc., etc. Philip II of Macedon, meanwhile, had been getting strong up there in Macedon. He thinks Greece is really cool. It's so cool, he'd like to have it. So he comes over and he basically conquers Greece, making a long story short. Eventually he is, unfortunately, killed. Assassinated. Sorry, I couldn't find the assassination word in my head for a moment. So he's assassinated, and his son takes the throne. Alexander the Great, megalomaniac, basically starts to conquer the world to the best of his ability. He conquers a huge amount of territory, partly because it's territory that's already been conquered. He takes over other people's empires. So it's easier that way. It's not like one place at a time. You just take over an empire. And so he takes over the Persian Empire, and that's a really good head start, you know. Taking over Greece was good too. Eventually he dies. He's quite young, and everything, gets a little scary for a while. Eventually, after a little fighting, his 3 top generals basically divvy up his empire. And we get the Seleucid Empire, the Ptolemaic Empire, and the Antagonic Empire. So they split it up. In art, I think it's a particularly interesting period of time because I know this is an art history class, but you know it's part of the material remains, so we certainly can't ignore it. So just giving you the quick glance, here we are looking at Hellenistic art. What do you see? Drama. Drama, 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 drama. Big, dramatic, flowing drapery, highly emotional, super intense. This is the Dying Gaul. It's actually one of my favorites, I confess, right? Oh, look at him. So we know he's a Gaul because he's got short cropped hair, right? So Greeks don't have short cut hair. And he's also got a torque around his neck. So we know he's a foreigner. So here he is dying bravely. It's extraordinary. So here we have some more drama going on, and here, whoa, serpent up in the top corner. There's Laocoon and his sons getting attacked. It's a reference to a part of the story of the Trojan conflict. And here's another interesting one. She's we call her the market woman. Lots. I've read a couple of different takes on her, but I think it's interesting. It's supposed to give you sort of this real life image of perhaps a prostitute that's had a tough night, and she's like disheveled and going off to the market with her bucket to get her stuff. And we're not just painting beautiful pictures of perfect males, but now they have to have a story and a drama in it, and women can occasionally be of interest as well. So, a little pause, chronological pause here, because we're going to need to switch focuses geographically. We've been focusing the last, I don't know how long, right? 20 minutes or something, been focusing on Greece. And now we're going to, after this slide, switch to our focus on Rome. But first, I just want to butt in here and say that Romans and Greeks are not the only people in the Mediterranean. And I know I keep saying things like that, and yes, we're going to focus probably a lot of time on them, but here's one more chance for me to interject with other people. Your book has referenced the two groups of people that I am highlighting here in this particular picture. On the left, I'm giving you the left two images. I'm giving you images of the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were based predominantly here in this dark blue area in the far eastern Mediterranean, and they become active initially about the 9th century BC, although we do see some activity earlier, like the 10th century, and quite honestly, they're probably the people trading with those Lefkandi people in Euboea. But the height of their activity is in the 8th century, and 9th century they create this colony in Carthage. 8th century, they create colonies elsewhere in the Western Mediterranean, all the blue places here. By the excuse me, certainly by the 8th and 7th century, the Greeks have joined in, and they are starting to make colonies in all the green places here. The Phoenicians are the gifters of our alphabet. First, they transfer it to the Greeks. Then it's transferred to early Italic peoples, including the Etruscans, which are these are two examples of Etruscan civilization. We don't know if the Phoenicians transferred it to the Etruscans directly or whether via the Greeks. Probably via the Greeks, because the Greeks were just living to the south of them. So it's probably through that contact. Bringing us to the Etruscans, here's two images, really hard to pick two. The good news is I get to talk about these people and a few others throughout week 7. So just in a couple of weeks, we will be focusing. I'll be able to show you more images of these peoples. And finally, I just would point you to this particular map on the bottom right-hand corner, which shows the various groups of people in the Italian peninsula prior to the rise of the Roman Empire. Okay, just a couple more slides, guys. We're nearly done. The fastest version of the history of Rome. So the rise of Rome, basically over 2 centuries, a bit more than 2. Rome rose from a settlement, a Villanovan settlement along the Tiber River, into a major power that would just through those 2 centuries dominate the entire Italian peninsula. Thereafter, which we'll get to our next slide, it would expand much further. So at this particular time, it's interesting to look at the dynamics, though, in the Mediterranean as a whole. because as expressed in your readings, that pardon me, as expressed in your readings, it really comes to a situation whereby three major powers are dominant and vying for, the top spot in the entire Mediterranean region, certainly by the 3rd century. Hellenistic Greeks in the east, which equate to, if you look at this map, remember I said that after the death of Alexander, then the empire, his empire is divided into three. If you look at this map, you can see the purple portion, the Antagonids here in the area of Greece. The green, the gold portion here, right, the Seleucids, and the green portion here, there are the Ptolemies. So all that is, representative of the way that, more or less, that the empire was divvied up by Alexander's three generals. Now, the second entity is the ones I started talking about, are the Romans. Like I said, they begin with this tiny settlement here in Rome, slowly, well, actually quite quickly, to be perfectly honest, expand and take over the entire Italian peninsula, as well as dominate many of the islands adjacent to them, both east and west, except for this tiny little portion down here, which they, at that time, but they fight for that, basically. They had been struggling with this other group of people called the Carthaginians. Now, the Carthaginians are interesting because they're actually descendants of the Phoenicians. And if you recall in the last slide, I talked about Phoenicians being an important group for maritime trade in the Mediterranean. Well, and I also had told you that the city of Carthage was founded probably about the 9th century BC. So, but eventually that city evolves over hundreds of years and becomes a very separate entity to the original homeland years before in Western Asia. And they eventually adopt a completely different agenda, one that's not all about maritime trade and access to resources, which is basically the Phoenician agenda. The Carthaginian agenda becomes one of expansion and dominance, much like that of Rome. So these three entities basically come into conflict with each other. And in all situations, Rome is the one that comes out as the dominant entity. Rome, as I said before, defeats the Carthaginians in a series of wars called the Punic Wars. It conquers Greece and also the Eastern Hellenistic lands and Egypt. Rome eventually becomes a bit too big to govern with a republic, to be perfectly honest. It's a militaristic state in which generals yield extraordinary power. They were afraid of their own military power. They had laws that prevented the military They used to have these processions, these big parades, these parades of victory, but eventually they stop allowing soldiers to even come into the city walls because they're afraid of their own military. And it's though that strong military had led to civil war in Rome more than once. So Rome, basically a result of that very situation, is the cause of a change in their political structure, in which they sort of still looked kind of Republican, because they still had a group of wealthy men who made strong suggestions but believed the thing did more, and called the Senate, but a very, very powerful single individual which was called from the Latin imperator, which is general, basically, which is where we get the name of emperor. And the first of these emperors is a guy by the name of Octavian, who we know as Augustus. And so here he is. Here's Augustus again. And I'm once again pointing out that Greek and Roman sculptures and were not meant to be bare and monochrome, that they were originally painted. And this is the Augustus Prima Porta. And again, we have found fragments of paint that have allowed us to recreate what it would have looked like. Very, very different than what we used to believe it looked like. Anyway, that was a bit silly. So the other thing I just want to bring to your attention is that, the Roman military society, again, I said they had these big parades when they won big battles. So it was really important to advertise military prowess and leadership and winning. And the image in the bottom here of the screen is just one of many, many triumphal arches that happened that were erected during the imperial period. This one happens to be located in North Africa. And this was erected at the end of the 3rd century in the Common Era. So, yes, the end of the Roman Empire, right? How do I say that in a few words? Scholars have spent whole careers just trying to figure it out, and I think your authors pretty much have it accurately. There's no one single moment. A lot of the lines of fragmentation were lines that were drawn hundreds of years before they fragmented. Rome, like I said, the powerful generals led to civil wars over and over again. They would see more and more of that. So in order to protect against a tyrant or civil wars, they started to share power. So it went from one emperor to 2 emperors. And then eventually goes from 2 emperors to 2 emperors plus 2 sort of assistant emperors. But this does not prevent these attempts to usurp the power by these various individuals. Eventually, the answer is to simply split the empire. And as I say, that this split led to a definitive break, and it's definitely after the death of Theodosius in the 4th century. And so those breaks and fractures continued along existing lines until they basically manifested themselves in the political lines that we saw in the medieval period. And beyond that, we have just that, the medieval period, which is followed by the Renaissance, which is followed by what many people term as the Age of Enlightenment, followed by the Industrial Revolution, followed by the Modern Age. And again, I want to point out that these things are important because when you're excavating in places that have been inhabited continuously over millennium, it's important to understand the context of the things that you might be finding. And so for that reason, it's important for me to explain it to you the best I can. I can't give you a bachelor's degree in history or anything, in 1 week session, but I can hopefully I have helped remind you of education that you've received in primary school, secondary school, and college, and filled in some of the blanks and given you enough foundation so that when your authors refer to these various periods, and some of the more famous individuals, they'll at least ring a strong bell. Thank you for your attention.